Hi, my name is Jill and I am obsessed with linguistics and Real Housewives. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the most talked about accents in Real Housewives history, which comes from the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City and the one and only Whitney Rose. Let's talk about it. So first of all, for those of you who have never watched Real Housewives and have no interest in it whatsoever, okay, fair enough, but I think you should consider how fun it is to watch because it is really fun, just saying. If you don't know what it is, Real Housewives is a reality TV show that focuses on the lives of housewives who are very, very wealthy. They have several different franchises and they do it by regions. So I think the first one ever made was Real Housewives of Orange County. And then there's like Real Housewives of New York City, Real Housewives of New Jersey, Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, Real Housewives of Melbourne. Like, it's expanded outside the US as well. That's how popular it is. You should try watching it. Just saying. I mean, it's reality TV, so it's like generally real. Probably not as real as we think, but not as fake as we think either. That's my guess. Yeah, so it's just a lot of rich ladies yelling at one another and drinking a lot and having cringy, sexually charged scenes with their husbands. Yeah. The focus of this video today is the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City and, like I said, the accent of Whitney Rose. I've chosen to focus on Whitney because, I mean, if you've watched Salt Lake City, then you are familiar with her accent and you've probably noticed it and been like, what? That doesn't sound like how people around me speak. And if you don't know, here's a little preview.
I just had this really weird moment, like I was here but not here. He feels like he's ready to leave the program early. I don't know what the next steps are to continue to heal and move on.
I didn't know that.
Heather, let's just be honest and real.
So that's what we're gonna look at today. We're gonna look at why she's talking like that, what's actually happening when she says stuff like that, and if it matters. The first thing I want to talk about is what's actually happening when she says that. So if you didn't maybe hear it or notice it, that's fine, don't worry. But what's happening is in a word like feel, where for me, I speak standard Canadian English, so I say feel. Whitney kind of says fill. So she might say, you know, you made me feel bad. And she would say, you made me feel bad. So it sounds like she's saying fill, like fill a cup instead of feel. That's what's happening in her speech. And I chose her because it's so extremely noticeable. Like, everybody on the internet is like, what's happening with Whitney's accent? Why does she talk like that? It's really, really prominent. It's really noticeable in her speech. To put it simply, she's changing the vowel. So as I said, I say feel, and I think a lot of English speakers across North America and elsewhere probably say feel versus fill, though saying fill is not uncommon. Instead of saying feel, she's saying fill. We got this in there. Let's use Canadian English as an example because I speak Canadian English, so it's easy for me to reference. In Canadian English, if you have a vowel chart, I'll show you a vowel chart. Of this vowel chart, you can see the vowel that's circled in the top left corner of the vowel chart. That is the vowel for E. This is the International Phonetic Alphabet. So if you're like, but that's an I, that doesn't make any sense. It's just representative of the sounds, the vowel sounds. So a lot of these are symbols that we use in IPA for, you know, if you've ever seen a word written out in all these weird symbols in like a dictionary beside the word, that's like the IPA of the word so that you know how to pronounce it. So it's an international alphabet representing sounds in a language. So that's why this says I, the letter I, but for IPA interpretation, you read it as E. So we can see that up in the top left corner of the vowel chart. And if you look just below that E, you'll see like an uppercase I, basically. What that symbol stands for is the sound I. So in a word like still, you would put that capital I, I. And a word like steel, you would put the lowercase I, E. And what's happening is Whitney is changing the way that she pronounces this E so that it sounds more like eh. As you can see, they're so close together already. So she's just kind of like starting to merge these sounds. And that's why sometimes she sounds like she's saying eh. She's saying like, I'm on my healing journey instead of healing journey. Now, why exactly is she doing this? I don't know. Like, it's just the way that Whitney was raised. Maybe people in her life spoke like that. Maybe it's just the way she says things. You know, I don't really know like why exactly she says that. But this does lead to a broader conversation about dialects in general and what kind of like makes them happen. So Whitney's from Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah, or from Utah generally. I actually don't know where she was raised, but she has a lot of connections to Mormonism, which is Utah. If you want Mormonism, you go to Utah. That's the spot. That's what I know about it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think Mormon, I think Utah. When I think Utah, I think Mormon. So she was born and raised Mormon. And so my assumption then is that she was also born and raised in Utah. And she also has a lot of, she has like a really important ancestor in the Mormon church. So that also leads me to believe that then she was born and raised in Utah, or at least she's born and raised into a Mormon family, which means that a lot of the features of her speech are going to be similar to Utah because there's a lot of Mormons in Utah. You follow my logic? This is important because regional dialects are a thing. So even in English, we can think of really obvious ones. Like I think maybe thinking about a New York accent is kind of like really obvious. We all have this idea of what a New York accent sounds like. But that's also a full English dialect, New York English. The same way I've been saying that I speak standard Canadian English. Standard Canadian English is a dialect of English. Anywhere you go that speaks English is going to have a dialect of English, and that's true throughout one country. Like Canada has several different dialects of English within Canada. Same with the United States, same with England, like a huge variety in England of English dialects. And then like anywhere else that you go that speaks English has its own dialect of English. It may not have regional dialects as varied as the United States or the UK, but there will be their own versions of English basically everywhere you go. I mentioned this because for Whitney and for some of the women on the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, they speak Utah English. And you might be like, well, what is Utah English? Utah English, like every other dialect of English, has its own features of the language. What is a feature? A feature is something like what Whitney does, how she pronounces that certain vowel. So instead of saying feel, fill, that could be a feature. This kind of merging of those two vowels could be a feature of Utah English. There are several other things that make a dialect. It may be things like vocabulary, certain, what we would call lexical choices, so basically the words you choose to use. It could be things like an accent, so how you say certain vowels. You might be choosing to omit certain grammatical structures. So all these things are features of language. And all of these different dialects have different features. So then the question becomes, is what Whitney's doing a feature of Utah English? And the answer is, I don't really know. Nobody knows. What the literature says is that a lot of people will identify this as part of Utah English. But when actual experiments have been done, so we can actually go in and measure vowels. Remember that vowel chart? Oh, here it is again. So on the vowel chart, you can see, again, this E and I fairly close together. So all of these vowels on this vowel chart can be measured actually using acoustic data. So you take a recording of somebody saying a word that has this vowel, and you can actually measure and see if what they're saying acoustically corresponds to whichever vowel. When people are asked if this is a common way of pronouncing things in Utah English, they say yes. So it doesn't seem to be a completely foreign thing to people in Utah. However, when it was actually measured by quite a few studies, although there aren't a lot of studies about Utah English, it's fairly new, but when it was actually measured, the researchers weren't finding an actual merger. So I've used the word merger, I just mean like the blending of those two vowels. And yeah, researchers didn't find that this was actually happening. They didn't find that these two things were actually coming together when they measured. They still saw distinct measurements for I and E. But then people still hear something, right? Like, we're not crazy. You're not crazy, I promise you. You're hearing, I'm hearing it, everybody's hearing it. You are hearing Whitney kind of saying like I instead of E in those words. It is happening. Basically what my conclusion from looking over the literature and doing my own kind of little measurements of it is that, yeah, okay, I guess like when you take these things and actually measure them, they're not the same exactly, but there's something happening. Whether or not it's an actual merger of these vowels or it's just a difference in pronunciation that doesn't manifest acoustically, like something's going on because we can hear it. So I don't know, I guess more research to be done on Utah English and the actual features of Utah English, because as of right now, there's nothing saying that there's a merger, but something is happening. Like we can hear it. We can hear it. There wouldn't be all these memes on Reddit if we couldn't hear it. So on a bigger scale, like, why is this happening? Again, I mentioned like Whitney might just be pronouncing things differently. It might be how people in her family spoke or people she was around growing up that spoke like that. And it seems to be enough of a phenomenon in Utah that researchers have taken the time to measure it and look at it and consider it. And it could be an influence of, so a lot of these dialects, you know, around the world, like language is influenced by history, right? So a lot of the Mormons who settled in Utah were from Illinois, Northeast Ohio. Some of them had New York accents to begin with. So it could just be this blending of all of these different dialects that came together and over time created this like amalgamation of all these different accents and dialects and then created Utah English. But again, whether this specific feature, this specific thing that Whitney Rose does, if it's an actual thing in Utah English, the research doesn't quite back it up yet, so we'll have to wait and see. Whitney might just be special. The last thing I wanted to address was whether or not this matters, and it doesn't matter. Like when we hear it, I hear it watching and I'm like, whoa. Like it really throws me off. But like ultimately it does not matter at all because we all know what she's saying. You know, you hear her say like, I'm on a healing journey, and you know she's talking about her healing journey. It's the same with any other accent or variety of English around the world. Pretty much as long as you're getting your point across and people can understand you, it doesn't really matter what you sound like. If you're a received pronunciation apologist, I hate to break it to you, it doesn't matter. There's no right way to do it. There's no right way to speak English. Controversial. Also, another thing I wanted to point out is that if you listen to the other women on the show, they do it too. I'm watching season 6. Is it season 6 they're on? I'm watching season 5 right now. Side note, how does everyone feel about Bronwyn? I'm divided. Like, first I liked her, and then I was like, ugh. And Todd's the worst. Anyway, so I've watched the show from the beginning, from 2020, season 1. And yeah, if you listen, other women on the show, they do it. Heather does it. I think I've heard Heather. I've heard Meredith do it. And I might have heard Mary do it. It's way less obvious. Like, for some reason, Whitney's is so pronounced and so strong. But they do it as well. So listen closely. I recommend. It'll be a fun little experiment for you. Maybe it's only fun for me because I'm a nerd about this stuff. That's okay. But seriously, listen closely, you'll hear it. And ultimately, like I said, it doesn't really matter. It's just a bit jarring, I think, if you're not used to it and you do notice it because it's just, like I said, so strong for Whitney. I'm all for it. I love it. And, you know, it's one of those little quirks that make Whitney who she is. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. I mean, if you're watching this, you're probably a Real Housewives fan, so go get yourself some Kerastase, fix that high body count hair, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!